Hello, everyone, and welcome to Warm Hugs with Suzanne. I have a brilliant guest with me this morning who has such a long list of credentials that I could probably spend the whole the whole podcast saying them. So I'm going to wrap them up very quickly, I think, and correctly. My guest today has two PhDs, one from Oxford University, one from Emory University. He has met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama numerous times and has written and co-authored countless papers, books, and courses. And the best way I think to describe those is actually the byline of one of your courses, Brendan, which is called Educating the Heart and Mind. I just loved that. So I would like to welcome Brendan Ozawa-de Silva. Welcome, Brendan.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Now, our podcast today has a very special focus, I think. We're going to be focusing on hope and looking at what hope means, the importance of hope, talking about maybe some practical ways of being hopeful and or getting hope back in your life and looking at what some of our hopes are. And to start though, one of my hopes every time I do one of these podcasts, Warm Hugs, is to really inspire, hopefully inspire, challenge, and leave the listeners feeling cherished. And for me, that the way I cherish someone is really through connecting. And I like to connect through checking in. So before we get into Brendan's life and talking more about hope, I just wanted to start by asking how you're checking in this morning, Brendan.
I am checking in pretty well, Suzanne. Thank you. I have been, things are going well for me. I'm happy to say. And I've been part of a big grant proposal for a 5-year grant for the National Institutes of Health that I'm very excited about seeing whether teaching empathy and compassion can reduce stigma for women with cervical cancer and HIV in Kenya.
Wow.
And it's a really big project and a bunch of us working on it. And so it's been a ton of work. It's also a learning curve for me to be part of a big global health grant like this. So it's been a bit stressful and it's been keeping me up at night thinking about it all the time. But it's also very exciting. So it's a kind of, I think, actually a kind of positive stress because I just see so much potential. So I'm pretty happy and hopeful that we get this grant. And even if we don't get it, I'm very hopeful about this direction of research.
Mm, beautiful. Yeah, gosh, that's more than I was doing this morning, Brendan.
I'm usually not doing anything as interesting, I can assure you.
I was just glad that I had a peaceful time getting my kids out the door to school this morning. So thank you for that. And so I guess I just wanted to start because no matter what your credentials are, I think that I feel like so often people forget that there's a person behind each one of us. And so before we get into, I guess, discussing the in-depth focus today, I was hoping that maybe you could just spend, I know it's not an easy task necessarily, but 10 minutes or so just telling us who you are. Like, who was Brent, who were you growing up and how did you get into this philosophical line of work as well?
Yeah. Um, well, I wanted to be a musician when I was a kid, and I think I chickened out. So that's how I
What
ended up
sort of
working.
musician?
I actually like all kinds of music, but probably the direction I would have gone in would have been classical music. So my greatest joy is composing and conducting.
Wow.
And I've had a few opportunities to do that. But in high school, that was my love, was just music. My high school decided to offer a music appreciation course for the first time. and me and a bunch of my musician friends all jumped in and took it. We were just so excited. And but even then, I knew, both my parents are doctors, and we have a lot of doctors in the family, and so you know, I didn't have a lot of role models in terms of going into the arts or doing anything like that. And I thought, wow, that's like a tough job, and I'll be on the road, and I probably won't make it because maybe I'm not talented enough, I'm not good enough. So I really doubted myself. Looking back, I think I would have been fine, you know. But at the time, I didn't have the confidence, and so I thought, no, I'll go and study. And I ended up going into academia and going into teaching and research. And but I think that's what led me to meeting the Dalai Lama and kind of changed the whole course of my life. So I don't regret anything. And music is still my main hobby. But I do think sometimes like what would have been my life would be quite different if I hadn't chickened out and followed my passion originally.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's a bit it's so it can be so important to have that creative outlet though, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things I love about education is I get to be creative in how I teach and the materials we create for other teachers.
Hmm.
And I like to incorporate games and the arts and things like that.
Hmm.
I'm still trying to figure out how to incorporate music more.
And Brendan, what's your cultural background?
My father's family are from southern India, and my mother's family's from southern China. So I'm Indian and Chinese on the two sides of my family. But they both grew up as immigrants. Their parents were immigrants in Malaysia. So they grew up in
Wow.
Malaysia when it was a British colony. They went to med school there, yeah, university, and then came to the States. And I was born in Boston. So I'm a Bostonian. I'm wearing a Red Sox shirt right now. So Red Sox baseball. So um, yeah, but I grew up in the States, but I have a lot of family in Asia. So
Yeah. You're a global citizen. See, I actually thought that you had some Japanese heritage because I know that you go back to Japan a lot.
yeah, and my wife is Japanese, and we hyphenated our names when we got married. So I have a Japanese. Ozawa is Japanese, and then De Silva is Portuguese because the Portuguese were in India. They went to Goa, so there are Indians with Portuguese last names.
Wow, you really are. You are a global citizen.
Yeah, yeah. I like to think of myself that way. I mean, being like, Chinese and Indian, I'm I feel like I'm related to, over 2 billion, like 2.5 billion people in the world. Of course, of course, that's a myth. We're all related.
Hmm.
So I'm not just related to Indians and Chinese, but I do feel like a strong connection to Asia and having,
Yes.
wife who's Japanese and my parents who grew up in Malaysia, family all across Asia. And then growing up in the States, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
I do.
I often think of the 6 degrees of separation. And for example, in meeting you, I figure now I've met the Dalai Lama. And everyone who's listening to this can be like, well, now they've met the Dalai Lama through you.
Suzanne, one of the things I really liked that I heard the Dalai Lama say was that his intention was to try to connect to every single person on the planet, have a
Mm.
connection. He actually wanted to meet every person on the planet if he could. And so now, sadly, he's quite elderly. He's not traveling a lot, but
Hmm.
up until not very long ago, up until 5 years ago, he was basically just on the road half of the year, just traveling as much as he could, seeing as many people as he could, trying to make that personal connection, and that really is inspiring to me. So that's why I really like to meet people from all over the world and make connections because um, I was inspired by him, and he's definitely a global citizen.
Yeah.
If you think about people who think about the whole world, yeah,
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and it's pretty amazing, isn't it? So if you think about it that way, through each of us, he is meeting all of us, and we are meeting him and we're meeting you. And yes, that's why I do this podcast, because I really do. I feel like sharing our stories is what brings us hope and wisdom. And I guess that brings me into my next question. Brendan, I wanted to ask, what what does hope mean to you? and why is it even important to us?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think hope is extremely important. I think that without some degree of hope, there is no will to live, no reason to move forward. There's no energy in life. I'm not sure we can have purpose and meaning in life without hope. And but to be honest, I've only thought about hope a few times in the past. I think a lot about compassion and empathy, because and bias and equanimity, understood as the opposite of bias, and how we get past bias. But hope comes up occasionally because actually hope is fundamental to compassion and empathy. You have to hope to have compassion. You have to hope that suffering can be alleviated, that something can be done.
Mm.
If you feel nothing can be done, you know, feeling compassion would just lead to empathetic distress and feelings of helplessness and despair, you know. So I think hope is essential. And I see myself as a hopeful person. And you mentioned the Dalai Lama. I see him as a hopeful person. I see one of his roles in this world is to give hope to people. He's always he's very aware of all the problems in this world, but he is still hopeful despite that. And he's aware that change will take a long time, but he's still hopeful. And I remember some of my students, some of my graduate students 10 years ago, who were just getting to know me. They're master's students in psychology. These two young women who were very, very bright. When they first met me and started taking classes with me, they thought I was very naive because they thought anybody who's so hopeful
Yes.
must not know about the problems of this world. And they were kind of surprised to learn that, I had spent time teaching in prison. I spent 5 years teaching in a maximum security prison, that I was aware that, people have done some really terrible things to each other. I was you mentioned my degrees. I got a degree in German history. So my DPhil at Oxford, my doctorate at Oxford, was in modern German history. You can't study 20th century German history and not recognize that people can do very bad things to each other.
Yeah.
So I don't see myself as naive. And I have traveled the world. I've seen extreme poverty in India and elsewhere in Asia. Slum communities, children in the streets, children who were maimed by their own parents so that they would be more effective at begging for money. Terrible, terrible things like that. I don't see myself as a completely naive person. But it's funny when you say that you're hopeful, people might think that hope is coming from naivete. And people say that about the Dalai Lama. They say, it's easy for him to talk about love and compassion. What does he know? He's a monk and he's led this sheltered life. And they don't understand that the Dalai Lama is someone who lost his own country. The estimates are about 1 million Tibetans were killed during the Chinese occupation and shortly thereafter. Almost all, over, I think 95% of the monasteries were destroyed. And the Dalai Lama lost his country and lost his connection to his homeland. His people went into exile. He's a person who's known tremendous suffering. And a lot of the Tibetans that came out into exile with him then were not adapted to the jungles of India and the climate. A lot of them died during that transition or just crossing the Himalayas. So his optimism doesn't come from naivete. But I think that hope comes from a realistic understanding of our situation, that change is possible if we work towards it, and particularly if we work collectively towards it. So I think hope is essential for us as humanity. And I'm concerned when I see a lot of people expressing a loss of hope, a loss of optimism. Yeah, because that's not going to help us move forward.
No. Do you know, I really, there's so many bits of that I can relate to as well, because especially the naivety, that's something that sometimes I even feel myself. Maybe I'm being naive because I am trying to be hopeful. But for example, I was listening to a podcast myself recently, and they were talking about the the human revolution, the humanity revolution. And it really is, it's this understanding that it's no one else that makes the change, like that each of us has that power within us to make this change. And one of the things one of the things when I was preparing for this, even because I thought, gosh, Suzanne, so what do I think of hope? I sort of asked myself, and I thought, what do I hope for? And I did like a brainstorming. And one of the things that occurred to me was that, first of all, that there's these levels of hope. Because my first thought was, oh, well, I hope for world peace. But it was a bit daunting. It was sort of too much for me. And I went, okay, Suzanne, take it back, strip it back. Let's start with me. What do I hope for me, truly? And one of the things I realized that I was writing on my list a lot of things about feeling. It wasn't like I want to be happy. It was that I want to feel happy, or, I want to feel inspired, feel. And then I sat there thinking, how strange is this? Because this is about how I can feel, and I'm the one who has control over how I feel. And it was, I don't know, it's just this interesting linkage to then go, wow, so this hope really does start in me, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, but I guess the thing with that is that so many people do tend to, I don't know, either forget, or there are those dark times. I mean, I've had them, and I'm sure you've had them as well, where you feel, what's the point? What's the point?
Yeah.
Or it's too hard, or I'm not making a difference, or um, I'm hopeful, but I'm surrounded by people that are so negative that it's it's drowning me. What do we
Yeah.
do? What are some practical things we can do in life to become more hopeful or to hold on to it?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. And I was also thinking in preparation for this podcast, why do people have hope and why do they lose hope? And I think it is very natural to lose hope. And I wouldn't want anyone to think, if people are listening to this and feeling hopeless or feeling a bit down or a bit helpless, that there's anything wrong with them for feeling that way. That's a
Mm,
natural reaction. I think it's a natural reaction when we encounter failure and adversity, and when we encounter a lack of social support.
mm,
Other people are not helping us, and we're not seeing other people help with the problem that we're focusing on. And I think that will lead to us losing hope. But in terms of how we regain our hope, we have to think about not just the times we failed or this present failure. We have to think about all the times we succeeded or made progress. And we have to think about the people who are helping. Whatever the situation is, there are always people working towards that. So even if our hope is for something as vast as world peace, that might seem
mm,
unattainable, there are people working towards peace. And the more we focus on them and understand what they're doing and their work, that will give us hope. So one of my favorite heroes is actually Mr. Rogers, who had a TV show
ah,
here in the
yes.
States. Yeah. And he had a lot of wisdom, Mr. Rogers. And one of the things he said was, look to the helpers. Look to the helpers. It's a very simple phrase, but it's a way of seeing that there are always people there trying to make the world a better place to fix problems. So we can't, the media is very good at pointing us towards all the problems,
Mm,
and it's less good at pointing us towards all the people that are actually trying to solve those very problems. When I first went to work in prisons, which I did as a result of meeting the Dalai Lama for the first time in 2003, during that meeting, he was giving some teachings on compassion, which were amazing. And my wife and I flew up to New York City to attend those. But one day he came late to one of the teachings, and he said, "Sorry, I was having lunch with people, and they were telling me more about the prison system in the U.S. and the crisis of mass incarceration in the U.S." And he said, and they were asking me, what should we do about this? And he said, I told them, well, I'm Tibetan, and you're Americans, and this is not a Tibetan problem. This is an American problem. So don't ask me what to do about this. You're the ones that have to solve this and fix
Oh, I
this.
love it. Yes.
Yeah. And he said, but you have to fix this. This is a big problem you have in this country. And I heard
Mm.
that and I thought, wow, that's okay. That gave me hope, actually, that this was a problem. I thought, well, what can I do? It took me 10 years before I could actually start teaching regularly inside a prison, thanks to the help of my colleagues who helped me gain access. But when I went in, what I realized was that there are a lot of people going inside, trying to help, trying to create higher education in prison programs, trying to help people who are incarcerated, teaching meditation in prison. So I taught CBCT, compassion meditation, in prison for 5 years. And so I saw the helpers. I saw the people who were trying to change things, and I got to meet other people working to reform the criminal justice system nationwide. And I'm connected to many of those people, and those people are also my heroes, because they're every week. Some of them are on the road, flying around the country, raising awareness, meeting with politicians, meeting with donors, meeting with organizations and unions, trying to change the system. And they're making progress. They are raising awareness, and people now realize that criminal justice reform is an absolute necessity in the US. And it's a bipartisan issue. And my students, I see it even at Emory 20 years ago, that time I first met the Dalai Lama, there were no organizations in Georgia helping people who were incarcerated. I couldn't find any. Now we have multiple undergraduate student organizations at Emory alone working on this issue. So it's been a sea change. So when you see that people are working towards change, and change takes time, then you gain hope. So if we just focus on the failures and the difficulties, we'll lose hope. So hopefulness doesn't come, in my mind, from naivete. It actually comes from realism. It comes from understanding. It's like anything that's difficult. I'm sure you've learned to do many difficult things in your life. And it could be very simple things like gardening, cooking. I mean, you raise kids, so you very a lot of serious things there. But if somebody doesn't have the experience and doesn't know how to do that, they might not have hope, right? But because you have experience and I know this is a bit challenging, but I've done this many times. I know I can do it. So your hopefulness doesn't come from naivete. It comes from experience and realism. And so I think that's something I've learned from the Dalai Lama, is that let's study a problem. Let's understand the problem. Let's not run away from it. And then we will see sources of hope. And because they're based on understanding reality. It's not just a naive hopefulness. It's a concrete, realistic hopefulness.
So we're saying, so one thing is definitely, so I love that. Look for the helpers. Look for the other people that are doing things. See that you're not the only one. There's, I guess and I don't want to be sounding negative, but I feel like a lot of the response to some of these things but there might be all of these people doing this help and still we're getting nowhere. Or, for example, and not to necessarily get into politics, but there was a lot of, I guess, even with this latest election, there's been a lot of people are hopeful for change, and a lot of people seem to feel hopeless that the right change hasn't been made.
Yeah, well, I think we have to have a broad perspective. So if we're only focusing on one issue, maybe we're not going to solve that issue today, tomorrow, next year, 50 years. It's possible there's some issues we will never solve as human beings. But that one issue isn't the only issue that's there, right? That one problem isn't the only problem. So if we can't solve one problem, if we just fixate on that one problem, we could just lose all hope and give up. But there are lots of problems in the world. That's
Yeah.
why I'm saying we cannot be naive. There
Yeah.
are a lot of problems, right? Maybe you can't fix this one problem, but is there another problem that's also important that you can fix? You know, um, the conditions have to be there for us to solve problems, and we can't do it alone. So if you're trying to solve one problem and you feel alone and you don't feel like anyone's helping you, then either one has to be a little more patient, or one has to say, I don't think I'm going to make progress here. I'm going to move on and do something else. Like for example, a lot of my friends, yeah, were very upset by the election results, and I was disappointed as well. But here in the States, but you know, it, several of my senior colleagues talking to me, they said, I realized, Brendan, I can't change things in Washington, but there are things I can change here right around me.
Mm.
And I'm going to focus on that. And I thought that's very wise. Yeah, because to focus just on problems we can't solve is going to make us feel hopeless and helpless. And then we're going to fall into despair. And it's not empowering, and it doesn't help us, and it doesn't help anyone. So we have to focus on the things we can change.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those things that we can change, we can make progress, even if it takes time. And those things might be connected to other things, right? Interdependence. And gradually, maybe that intractable problem that we can't tackle directly, we tackle it indirectly. Because any major discovery, certainly world peace, there is no one silver bullet to achieving world peace. There are 1,000 things we need to change in our society and in our world, all our societies, to achieve world peace. 1,000 things we need to fix. So if we just think I'm going to, fix world peace, I mean, that's not realistic. We can do little bit by bit, right?
Yeah.
We have to think about how our societies are funding arms companies and why we're spending so much money on military spending and why our diplomacy efforts break down. And are we educating children for peace rather than for war and conflict? And our economic systems, right? So things like the EU, right? The EU was set up to with the purpose of establishing peace in Europe, right? That economic integration would make war within the continent impossible, right? And why did they do that? Because Germany just kept invading everybody again and again and again, right? Like 3 times in a row within the space of 100 years, Germany nearly took control of the entire continent, right? So, the countries around and the Germans themselves after World War II said, hey, we need to stop this. This is crazy. We need to be contained,
Yeah.
right? And so how do we do that? So then they started thinking economic integration, free movement of people, all these things. That was just a dream, right? And it probably seemed impossible to many people after World War II, but they created it, right? And they made it much harder for them to go to war again in that way. So that's intelligence, right? That's realism, not hoping for world peace. One of the things I love the Dalai Lama say, and I just heard him say it again, if we want world peace, we can't just pray for world peace. He's not a big advocate of prayer. we need a realistic approach.
Yeah.
We need to study what are all the different conditions that would lead to that. And then of all those conditions, what's the one that I can make a contribution to? Because each one of us can definitely make a contribution to one of those 1,000 things. And then we're making a contribution to world peace. And maybe it doesn't happen 50 years from now or 100 years from now. But who cares? If it happens 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now, wouldn't that be amazing? That would be one of the most amazing things in human history, right? So the other thing the Dalai Lama says, which I think is very wise, is if our cause is noble, then whether we achieve it in our lifetime or not is largely irrelevant.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to have your name attached to it, does it?
No, I think it's probably better if it doesn't.
That's right. But sometimes, I think that maybe we lose track of that, and we think, I'm not doing anything unless this is World Peace by Suzanne,
I kind of like that actually. I think you should write a book with that title. Yeah. Or that you can rename the podcast.
I'm starting with warm hugs.
Okay, that can
That's
be
my
the next
that's my
podcast.
way to get to world peace. But I guess I'm thinking, so like some of the things we've said here are to become more hopeful. Look at the other people who are around you, the other helpers. Maybe try and be a bit more realistic, you know, really understand what's going on and look at what you can do rather than what you can't do to help in situations. But I guess what I'm thinking with your most recent, what you were just saying there as well, is maybe sometimes why we lose a lot of hope is because we are so focused on ourselves. And to gain more hope, if we start looking outside ourselves as to how we can help others and find our greater purpose, this can be a major way to become hopeful. And in this
Yeah.
year ahead, perhaps rather than it even being New Year's resolutions for ourselves, maybe it's a New Year's resolution as to how we can help others
Yes.
and become, but again, it doesn't need to be World Peace by Suzanne. It can be, it can be enjoying cooking the meal for my family by Suzanne and do it with love rather
Yeah.
than feeling it's a necessity that I must do it and hating doing it. Is this a practical way we can be more hopeful in our day-to-day lives?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, one of the things you're touching on, which I think is very, very important, is that hope isn't just an individual thing. It's a social thing.
Mm.
Um, so not only are we going to be more hopeful if we're more other oriented and focused on others rather than just our own problems narrowly, but also we can be a source of hope for others. And we are. And, when I think about where hope comes from, it comes from others, actually, not ourselves. So, for example, you know, so my research areas in cognitive science, looking at emotions, pro-social emotions like compassion, forgiveness, empathy. Um, and a lot of research in psychology and neuroscience is very individualistic. Like where do we find hope in the brain? Where do we find hope in the individual? What is hope,
Is
right?
there a
How do
spot?
we have more hope? Yeah. And where do we find compassion? Where do we find empathy? That's great. I mean, some of my colleagues do that research. That's wonderful. They should do that. But I also think I'm very driven by the idea that I'm very influenced by social psychology and developmental psychology, which is all relational. So compassion and empathy are actually things that emerge relationally between us, not just inside us. And hope is the same. So when you're growing up, if you are told you're a failure, if you're not given social support, if you don't feel supported by your community, your family, your country, your friends, then you will feel hopeless.
Mm.
And there's research, some foundational research around hope. There was a psychologist that did experiments with rats, and a lot of bad, mean psychology experiments have been done in the past, and I think we should not do them anymore. But what he did was he wanted to see whether he would put rats in water and see how they reacted when they were drowning.
Mm.
And one of the interesting things is, do they fight or not? And one of his discoveries was if he put a rat in the water, but as it was floundering about, he reached in and saved it. So then in the future, when he put that rat in the water, the rat would fight much longer to stay afloat.
Wow.
Then the ones who were not rescued and saw other rats not being rescued. Those rats didn't have any hope. So they didn't fight. They thought, well, if I'm drowning, then, I'm a goner. No one's going to help me. Right. So this is really important because I think it shows that if we have been in situations where we've been in trouble and faced adversity, but we have seen others step in, help us, and we've been able to overcome that adversity, then the next time we face adversity, we feel, oh, I think I can get through this again because I'm not alone. There are helpers,
Mm.
right? There is a chance. So we'll fight and we'll try to make a change and we'll do the best we can, whether we succeed or not. But if we haven't grown up with that and haven't seen that, then we can easily just give up. Even if the adversity is not that great, maybe we just give up because we don't think anyone's going to help us. We don't see a solution. We don't have experience of finding a solution, of being saved, right?
Mm.
So what this means is that we have a great role to play in the lives of others. Every time we help another person, every time we are doing something to solve a problem and other people see that, whether it's as simple as making a meal for your family or being kind or being there for a friend, we're actually supporting the hope of that person.
Yes.
And the Dalai Lama often says, because he talks a lot about compassion, he always says he learned compassion from his mother. So that's where hope comes from. It comes from being cared for.
Mm.
Now, a lot of people didn't grow up having that warm environment, right? So for those people, it's harder. But we can help those people too by creating warm environments for them and showing them that there are reasons to be hopeful and there are people who will support you. And so we can promote hope, not just in ourselves, but in others. And I think that's
Yes.
maybe the best thing we can do.
Yes, definitely. And actually, I've got a little story for you that I guess I wanted to point out the fact that as well, you never truly know the impact that you've had on other people. And you don't even have to have met them even necessarily. So one of the ways that I came to know of Brendan was that I did a course called CIT. And Brendan was one of the co-authors of that course. So I hadn't met Brendan until I did my next course that I've done more recently with Emory University. But when I did CIT, that was in 2019. And I met a group of people there that I have stayed in contact with. And in fact, we very often, normally we meet at least once a month on Zoom still. There's four of us women from around the world in the US, Australia, Edinburgh, and now Bahamas. And I was just thinking, wow, you know what? They have been such a source of counsel for me and such a such an amazing, they fill my cup. They help to fill my cup and make me feel not so alone in the world. And just beautiful women that I can speak to. And I thought, you know what? This is an impact that Brendan would have had absolutely no idea that he was going to make when he was writing that CIT course. And I just thought it made me think this is yet again one of these examples of smiling at someone when you're at the grocery store and not knowing truly exactly what impact you could be having on them and their life. Whether it's writing a course, whether it's smiling at someone, saying hello, having that connection with people, we never know that you so often can be giving hope to people that you just didn't even realize. So
Yeah.
that's something I wanted to thank you for, Brendan, which you wouldn't necessarily even know that you have helped me in that way through doing that course.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. And I have to be thankful to my colleague at Life University, Michael Carlin, who drove that process.
Mm.
And kind of sat me down and said, Brendan, we need to write this thing. We need to write this manual and get this program going. And Michael got his PhD at Emory. We were both graduate students together and then ended up working together. And then also be thankful to Geshe Lobsang Tenzin, who's the director of our Compassion Center at Emory, where I now work, and created the cognitively based compassion training program, CBCT, which it was the first compassion training protocol of its kind back in 2004. And CIT was largely was kind of a derivation of that in many ways, or so your story is beautiful. It doesn't surprise me because CBCT started in 2004, and CBCT itself started because of the Dalai Lama's focus on spreading compassion. And so that started a long time ago. And I've seen thousands of people directly impacted. I'm one of them by that vision. And then more people impacted and more people impacted. And now you and this group of 4 women you're just describing, that you're part of, you're impacting others. So that ripple effect you're talking about is very real. And we can't see all the people that it's going to impact. We can't see the effects, but we can know that it's happening. And that's also a source of hope, right? That these little things that you're doing, another program we have at Emory is called SEELearning, Social, Emotional, and Ethical Learning. Yes. It also grew out of CBCT because in 2008, 2009, a colleague of mine, Brooke Dodson-Lavelle, who was also a PhD student at Emory, she and I went. Geshe Lobsang had been asked to bring compassion training to schools with little kids around Atlanta, where we are located. And so Brooke and I went to this elementary school, a private school here close to Emory University called Paideia. And we started teaching CBCT for kids. We created an adapted version and made games and stories and everything. And realized that even this complex program with CBCT, which you know very well now, Suzanne, now you're a certified teacher of it, you know how much material is in there and how heady and intellectual that material can be. So imagine teaching that to 5-year-old kids. So we did that. And because we had some success with it, we then had the confidence to start writing it out as lesson plans. And now we have the SEELearning program many years later. Again, thanks to Geshe Lobsang's leadership. But that call came directly from the Dalai Lama. And last summer I was the main curriculum writer for that program, and wrote all these lessons. And it's in over 40 countries now. And this past summer, I was in Japan, and I got to visit a school in a very rural, mountainous part of Japan, in Nagano Prefecture, and took hours to get out to this school. And then I'm sitting in the school and I'm seeing this Japanese teacher teaching a class of about 28, 9-year-old kids in Japanese. And she's teaching this lesson from our curriculum, a lesson that I wrote,
wow,
8, 9 years ago. And I'm just like, it's surreal. I'm halfway around the world seeing this happening. And I'm just like, this is crazy. So I think we often, as you said so beautifully, we underestimate the impact we can have on others. But if we think about interdependence, we can see that impact is very real.
Yeah. Gosh, that is amazing. It's amazing. And that's part of how it's so incredible what we are able to do in the world today as well. Now, Brendan, I wanted to just ask, what are you currently working on? Well, you've actually said about what's happening in Kenya already, but what are you currently working on? How can my listeners find out more about you and keep in touch? And I guess what's a bit of your hope for this year and beyond?
Sorry, Suzanne. We got some people working on the house.
That's okay. That's okay. Those who are on YouTube watching us have just seen a little bit of Brendan's house. So he's done a walk around for us. Yeah, we're on YouTube as well.
Oh, okay. I had no idea. Okay. Yes. Well, this is my house. Well, we have something very exciting happening at Emory. So I work at a center at Emory called the Center for Contemplative Science and Compassion-Based Ethics. And prior to that, it I mean, it grew out of a program called the Emory-Tibet Partnership, which was established by the Dalai Lama, a relationship between Emory University and Tibetan institutions of higher learning. And the Dalai Lama is actually a presidential distinguished professor at our university, which a lot of people don't know, but it's very special. It's the only university outside of India where he has such an affiliation.
Wow.
So we have something coming up next year called the Compassion Shift. And that is an initiative to create a global culture of compassion, or maybe not create it, but to try to shift our world more towards compassion on a global scale. And the way we're doing that at our center is through these two programs: cognitively based compassion training, which is our adult education program to promote compassion, empathy, self-compassion, and SEELearning, which is our educational program where we provide resources for teachers and for schools to teach and explore compassion, but not just compassion, the whole range of social emotional development skills that are necessary, that we believe are necessary for children, and that the Dalai Lama believes is necessary, not from the perspective of religion, but from the perspective of science and basic human values. So the Dalai Lama he asked us to develop that program, and it's a free program, which is great, thanks to generosity of funding that he arranged for us. So we're very fortunate to have those programs. And what the Compassion Shift means concretely is trying to bring in people from all around the world, like yourself, to be part of this movement, to say that, we can make a difference. We should be hopeful. Science has advanced a lot. 20 years ago, we couldn't talk about a science of compassion. But now there's a book called the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science. It's out there, and there are hundreds of articles every year being published in scientific journals looking at compassion in healthcare, looking at the effect of compassion in the brain, as I mentioned, the effects of compassion on health, on relationships, on depression, anxiety, even the effects of compassion on healing. And this is really, really exciting. And I think at our center, we want to contribute to this. And as I mentioned, for me, what's very exciting is talking with colleagues in global health and public health, and realizing that one of the biggest obstacles right now in treating infectious diseases and all sorts of diseases and disorders, everything from diabetes, tuberculosis, cancer, HIV, loneliness, and suicide, one of the biggest obstacles is stigma. So because of stigma, people are not getting screened. If they are screened, they are not seeking treatment. If they do enter treatment, they're not completing treatment because of stigma.
Gosh.
And stigma even affects healthcare providers. Healthcare providers might consciously or unconsciously be stigmatizing the people they're working with. For example, we have a project looking at leprosy in India. The healthcare providers themselves might become objects of stigma for working with certain populations.
Yes.
So, stigma is so pervasive. And now the world of global health and public health and medicine is realizing this is a massive issue. But the funny thing is, you can't solve stigma medically, right? You can't give someone a drug or medical treatment, and then now you've solved stigma.
Wow,
so,
true.
Yeah, so they have to work with, we need to start looking at other things. So how do you actually solve stigma? And then you realize, oh, stigma is actually a lack of empathy and compassion. Stigma is othering people, putting a label on people and distancing yourself from them, right? And so the solution to stigma is empathy and compassion. And the solution to self-stigma is empathy and compassion. So that's why I'm so excited about this research that we're undertaking. And I think if we can make a small contribution to cracking this nut, then we can see very concretely the compassion and empathy, as the Dalai Lama says. We've been quoting him a lot on this podcast, but rightfully so. Um, Compassion and love are not merely luxuries, but they're essential for human survival. They sound very abstract to people, very pie in the sky. But again, we must be realistic and see what's leading to people dying and having worse health outcomes than necessary. Stigma is one of those things. How do we solve stigma? The only way to solve it is by promoting empathy. And how do we promote empathy? Well, we have a science now of empathy and compassion. So this is the world that we are creating. This is why this research is important. And I think it's very, very hopeful, very hopeful. And we're not there yet, but we are really making progress in this direction. So we have every reason to be hopeful.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, it fills me with hope just hearing about it, because, and it is like, even with you talking about stigma, it made me think of one of our CBCT classes where you actually even asked the question, and I guess I was relating this to stigma as well, where you asked the question, how do I get more men interested in compassion and interested in these compassion courses? And so I guess this is something I'm putting out to my listeners as well, because I guess in my mind, I feel like sometimes there can be this stigma that, yes, compassion is airy, fairy, fluffy, feminine, I don't know. But there's so much more to it, and there's so many levels in there, and it does have so many benefits, as you've said as well. So any listeners, I will put all of the details for Emory University up there, so you can look into these courses as well. And especially my male listeners, I'm going to put the challenge out there to you to maybe have a think about what compassion, hope, what all of these words mean to you. And if you're interested in delving into them a bit deeper and maybe looking at how they can actually help you. This is about figuring out how to de-stress, how to handle stress in your life, how to have better relationships with people, and then how to look at the greater systems around you. This isn't airy fairy stuff. This is about how to help yourself and then how to help others as well. So I'm so grateful that you're able to join me here today, Brendan. I know you've got a lot on your plate. And it's been brilliant to talk to you and to have got to know you through the CBCT program. And I am very privileged and honored to say I am part of the official Compassion Shift. And I'm looking forward to having my first CBCT workshops in this new year as well.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. It's been great talking to you. It's been great having the opportunity to think more about hope. It's been helpful for me and fun. And if you don't mind, can I plug my podcast?
Oh, yes, I actually wanted to plug that as well. That
Okay.
everyone can hear you as well. You do the plug for me.
Okay. Well, the funny thing is that this podcast wasn't originally my idea. It came from a student at Emory University, Kitty Graham, who just graduated, and she loves podcasts and asked me if we could start a podcast. So we started the podcast. It's called Mindful Dialogues, learning from and about one another, and it's on Simplecast is where you can find it, but hopefully you can provide the link as well.
Yeah.
And Kitty is a funny story because she was my student at Emory University and wrote her senior honors thesis on empathy and architecture. But she was actually first my student when she was a 6-year-old girl in that class I mentioned in
No
2000.
way.
Yes, in the very first class when we tried to teach CBCT to little kids.
Wow.
And she'd always sit in the front row, and she loved to meditate, and she went home and would teach her parents about it and her grandmother about it. And but she went off she was already doing ballet then, and her family actually moved to New York City from Atlanta to support her ballet career. But then when COVID hit, all the ballet companies, she was just turning 16, 17, all the ballet companies were shutting down temporarily. and not taking anyone in.
Yeah.
So she missed her window of being a professional ballerina. And once you miss that window, you can't do anything because people couldn't train, you know. So she had to change plans and she decided to go to college, go to university. And she then thought, well, maybe I could go to Emory. And she reached out to me and said, hey, do you remember me? And I said, of course I remember you.
Oh my
And she
goodness.
came to Emory to study. Yeah. And she's off now at Cambridge University doing her master's, continuing to look at empathy. So I just think it's amazing. And so the podcast was her idea and came out of us being reunited at Emory. And so our first series is on forgiveness, and our second series now that we're doing is on educating for empathy.
And it is amazing stories. The people that you guys are speaking to are incredible. I was listening, I think the one I listened to yesterday, and I'm terrible with names. Is it Robert Moore?
Richard Moore.
Richard Moore.
Yes.
Richard Moore. And I mean, we learn about him in our compassion course as well, but he's just, it's really an incredible story. And I really do recommend that everyone has a listen as well, because these are really important discussions to be having.
Thank you.
And
Well,
I
thanks so
love
much for this.
I love that story of how it came to be. You need to there needs to be a podcast of you guys telling your story
Yes,
in the
yes,
Mindful Dialogues podcast.
yes. We need to
I
do
hope
that.
to hear that soon as well. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Brendan. I will put all of the details on the notes of this podcast. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed today. I hope you felt a bit more inspired, challenged, and cherished by us. And I would so appreciate any likes, shares, comments. And I look forward to speaking with you and talking to you all again soon in the next podcast. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.